Today I wanted to talk about a book I read, The Fourth Turning by William Strauss and Neil Howe. In short, it's a book about how history repeats in cycles, also known as saeculums, which usually last 80 to 90 years, the length of an average human lifespan. And within each saeculum are 4 roughly 20-year chapters known as turnings, each coinciding with a different generation. The first turning is referred to as a high, where things are generally good and prosperous, and institutions are strong. The second turning is an awakening, a time of passion, progress, and radical social change. The third turning is an unraveling, when the institutions of the previous 2 turnings are weakened and begin to crumble. The fourth turning is a crisis, and if you haven't guessed already, we are currently living through a fourth turning. It's an era of total collapse, war, revolution, and destruction. Each 80-year cycle tends to mirror the previous cycle as they repeat again and again. The first turning of America's current saeculum began in the aftermath of the Second World War. It's what we imagine when we think of the 1950s. Conformity, consumerism, levee towns, the baby boom, rock and roll, and the beginning of television. This high ended when JFK was assassinated in 1963. And it's also important to remember that a high isn't easy for everyone, but this is addressed in the next turning. Our second turning, the awakening, was an era of social change. There was the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War protests, great music like the Beatles. There was Woodstock, hippies, and the first computers. The second turning ended when Ronald Reagan was re-elected in 1984. The third turning was when the post-war world began to unravel. We saw the fall of the Berlin Wall, grunge and rap music, the Columbine shootings, the LA riots, the Gulf War, the tech bubble, 9/11, and the war on terror. The third turning ended with the 2008 financial crisis. The fourth turning is what we are in the middle of right now. Previous fourth turnings culminated with World War II, the Civil War, and the American Revolution. But how will our fourth turning end? We began our current turning with a Great Recession, similar to the Great Depression in the previous saeculum, and it feels like we're gearing up for something big once again. With a pandemic, climate change, the rise of Donald Trump, an emerging new conflict in the Middle East, the war in Ukraine, and the threat of China, could we face another world war or a civil war? Anyone's guess is possible, but nothing is inevitable. And despite this seemingly bleak horizon, there is also an abundance of hope. After every fourth turning comes another high, a new beginning, like fresh growth after a forest fire, or the coming of spring after a long winter. In some sense, a crisis is a necessary part of progress. The theory put forth by the authors is compelling. I was skeptical when I first picked up the book, but they present evidence of the cycles of history dating back to the foundations of both the Eastern and Western world. Our linear way of seeing history and progress is relatively new. Ancient civilizations like the Roman Empire embraced these cycles. But the concept of turnings and saeculums begins not with society as a whole, but in the life of an individual. The idea of crisis is an inevitable part of a person's life. We face fourth turnings with every major change, and the more they rattle us and upend our sense of normalcy, the greater the new beginning on the other side. It's a cycle we face from birth to death, year to year, and day by day. And these cycles throughout our lives inevitably filter through into society as a whole, creating the cycles we see in history, in every region, country, and city. But as we move forward in time, and the various societies grow more centralized, as we evolve from tribes of hunter-gatherers, to city-states, to empires, to countries, and a globalized world, the process of saeculums becomes more obvious. This is why the post-World War II saeculum is more well-defined than the previous saeculums. The various cycles happening around the world are slowly aligning into one cycle. And this is where I think the authors are onto something. If they are right, there is a life-defining struggle ahead of us, with a stronger and better future less than a decade away.